We have a fiscal crisis. We have an energy crisis. We have a healthcare crisis, a pension system crisis, just to mention some of the challenges that we have right now.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and a contributor to the Bulwark. And I'm joined in my partner in all things strategery, Eliot Cohen, professor emeritus of strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Eliot, how are you? And more to the point, where are you?
Well, I can just say that I'm in a secure location somewhere in the mountains where it's cool and it is possible to buy in the grocery stores my favorite Vermont ales.
Okay.
That doesn't necessarily mean I'm in Vermont, so I'm not going to say anything more unless the Russians and Chinese and Quds Force are listening in. Eric, I think it's your turn for the jackassery of the week before I introduce our really interesting guest today.
Yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on the jackassery because we'll have, a lot more to say about the diplomatic whiplash that we've just engaged in over the last weekend on Friday and now today. I think we'll have a chance to talk about that next week. But I would nominate the governors of West Virginia, Ohio, and South Carolina who seem to think it really is incumbent on them to send, federalized National Guardsmen to the District of Columbia to deal with a totally contrived, invented crime wave, which I think totally unnecessary, but, kind of an indication of where our politics are right now.
Yeah, I sort of agree with that with a couple of qualifications. One is, there is a little bit of a mixed feeling about this because although crime has been going down in this district, there's still a fair amount of street crime.
Sure.
And when you talk to there's some people who are not entirely unhappy that there's more police and even federal National Guard presence. There's two thoughts that I have, though. One is they're not sending these folks towards 7 and 8, where a lot of the really violent crime occurs. They're having them wander around the mall where nothing happens.
Right.
So in a way, it's performative, of course. The more serious thing is there's been talk that fairly soon the National Guardsmen will be patrolling armed. Until now, they've been patrolling unarmed. And there are all kinds of dangers in that. One is that the National Guard are not trained for law enforcement. And good law enforcement is often about restraint, not about blazing away at bad guys. And secondly, a lot depends on who the National Guards are and where they're from, and whether they begin to feel like an occupying army of some kind, and there's tension with the local population. It's one thing if it's the D.C. National Guard; those are local people. The South Carolina National Guard are not local people, and they may be politically from a very, very different place. So there's potential for a real blow up there.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, what could possibly go wrong? So speaking of all that, we should also, I think we should, just before we turn to our guest, say a few words about, I think, what you have termed summit whiplash. We had President Trump literally rolling out the red carpet for Vladimir Putin in a somewhat nauseating spectacle. And then we had a troop of rather distinguished European leaders showing up with President Zelensky, this time wearing a black suit rather than fatigues, at the White House for a meeting that sounded relatively benign, in which President Trump began talking about the United States contributing to security guarantees for Ukraine. So real quickly, because I don't want to crowd too much of our time from our guest, what do you make of all that?
Was it Churchill who said, I think this pudding has no theme?
Yes.
I worry that part of what we're seeing here is, the spectacle on Friday was nauseating, as Boris Johnson, who is, not someone who could be easily accused of suffering from Trump derangement syndrome, since he's been widely touted as the United Kingdom's Trump. among other things, and also had a perfectly fine relationship with President Trump throughout his term as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He described it as the most vomit-inducing event in the long, tawdry history of international relations. Now, a colleague of ours pointed out to me that actually he did not get an honors degree at Oxford, and his degree was not in history. So he was a classicist. So, maybe he hasn't studied the tawdry history of international relations quite enough.
I was going to say.
But it really was a pretty depressing spectacle. Today was much better. The meeting with we don't know about the meeting yet, but the Oval Office press spray was less eventful, thank God, than the one on February 28th. And Zelensky, I thought, handled himself extremely well. The meeting, at least again, the press. Open to the press parts of the meeting with the European leaders was also, reasonably good. We'll see what comes out of it. If what comes out of it is a united insistence on the part of European leaders, Zelensky and President Trump, on a trilateral meeting with Trump, Putin, and Zelensky, that, among other things, we'll discuss serious security guarantees for Ukraine, that are tantamount to Article 5, as Steve Witkoff was saying over the weekend. That won't be a bad outcome, in part because I have my suspicions that the Russians will have no part of it. Yeah.
So I have, I guess, a number of thoughts. One is, I certainly agree about the spectacle in Alaska. There was something just pathetic about Trump continuing to whinge about the 2020 election in front of a foreign leader, and it was awful. It was embarrassing. Although I do think there are frequently a lot of embarrassing moments in diplomacy, particularly retrospectively. And I agree with your reading of the meeting today, insofar as we know anything about it. I guess my reactions are as follows. I follow a lot of the commentary, and a lot of people talk about Munich and Yalta, and I just think those are wildly off base, and they mislead you, and they get in the way of understanding what's happening for a bunch of reasons. First, it's unfair to Neville Chamberlain, who, after all, had 20 years earlier been through a devastating war. You have Roosevelt and Truman, who've lived through another devastating war, and in both cases, people think the next one could just end civilization altogether. Secondly, people were dealing with fait accompli, where there wasn't a whole lot you could do. Now, the British and French could have gone to war in 1938, and I think in retrospect, people think they would have won. So that there is that. At Yalta and Potsdam, and I know my Polish friends will be furious at me for saying this, there was no way that you were going to save Poland from Russia. It wasn't going to happen. And in 1938, would the Czechs have gone down swinging? Maybe, but maybe not. More importantly, here, what you have is you have the Ukrainians who are fighting like hell, and you have another actor, the Europeans. And I think, as we saw at the meeting today, that was a formidable group of people, actually. Americans are so used to dumping on the Europeans. If you look at the lineup, from Macron to Chancellor Merz to Prime Minister Maloney, this is not an inconsequential bunch.
And President Stubb,
absolutely, President Stubb and Secretary General Rutte, and they're clever and they know how to handle the president. But the other thing here is, Trump is a much lighter personality, let's say, than or much more inconsequential human being than a Chamberlain or a Roosevelt or a Truman. But it is important to understand his motivation. What is his motivation? His motivation is to get a Nobel Peace Prize. He does not have sort of deep sympathy, I think, with Ukrainians. He doesn't have deep sympathy with anybody, really. He wants the Nobel Peace Prize, and he has said as much. He cannot
over and over again.
And I think he is smart enough, however, to understand that he cannot get the Nobel Peace Prize without the cooperation of Zelensky and the Europeans. And that's the big difference. We're in a situation where, unlike in 1938 and unlike in 1945, there are other actors who have agency. So I'll spell out this argument in an article in The Atlantic pretty soon.
And I suspect David Kramer and I will have something to say about this as well, having done a preview of the summit in Alaska. We're going to do a postmortem. So
we will look forward to that. Why don't we move on to our guest, who I'm really delighted to have. This is someone who is a friend on top of everything else, and a good friend. So our guest today is Juan Carlos Pinzón. I can call him Minister Pinzón because he was Minister of Defense of Colombia for 4 years. I can call him Ambassador Pinzón because he's been Ambassador of Colombia to the United States not once, but twice. He has served as the Chief of Staff of the President of Colombia. He's had a whole bunch of appointments in both the private sector and in the nonprofit sector. He's somebody who's still very active in the politics of his country, and indeed is rumored to be considering a presidential run. And he is a superbly educated human being. And I would like to think that the pinnacle of that is when he studied at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, which is when we first met. So let me just begin by just expressing a really warm welcome to my friend, Juan Carlos Pinzón. Welcome, Juan.
Well, thank you, Eliot, Professor Cohen. As you know, my highlight on my now long career, is really being one of your students, and that's an honor.
Well, we're friends now, so at some point I'm going to persuade you just to call me Eliot. So let's. There's so many things we would like to talk to you about. Could you begin? We are really glad to have you here because, as Eric and I have said in other podcasts, we have unfortunately neglected Latin America, which is unfortunately an American failing in some ways. But I was wondering if you could just begin with talking about the state of your own country. I think we read recently the unfortunate death of Miguel Uribe, who I believe is the grandson of Álvaro Uribe, who you worked for, the president of Colombia, who really did turn things around, as far as I can see, in the long war against the FARC. You have the sense from afar, and perhaps you could say more of it, that a lot of the tremendous successes that were achieved in large part under your leadership and the leadership of others has been thrown away. So first talk to us about Colombia, and then we'll want to talk to you more about Latin America in general, and as well how you see the United States. But could you just start with Colombia?
Well, Eliot, Eric, what an honor to be here, first of all. This is not a regular podcast or, another podcast we do. You two are extremely recognized experts, real deep experts on the field of national security and strategic analysis. So to me, it's a privilege just to be invited here and to share thoughts with you. It's a different day for me. So thank you for that. I think about Colombia. As you will know, we were really considered the most violent country in the world by the end of the 90s. The end of the 20th century was dramatic for Colombia. We have around 80 per 100,000 homicides in the country, being the highest rate in the world. And really the country was under big trouble. Just to remind everybody that we not only had the cartels like Medellin and Cali that are well known because of movies and other things these days, but in addition to that, we inherited the Cold War guerrillas, FARC, ELN, EPL, and others, and even self-defense forces that responded to those. But with the bad news that because of drugs, they were able to become the strongest and the largest in the whole Western Hemisphere ever. So that was the kind of war and enemy we were trying to confront. An enemy absolutely well-funded, and an enemy really big in numbers and weapons and capacity to take even control of very large territories. Sometimes I like to remind people the size of Colombia. It can be Texas and California together, including small states like Vermont, New Hampshire, and Delaware and others put together. So that all fits in Colombia. So it's quite big. Or you can think in European terms like 2.5 times Germany, just to imagine the size of Colombia. And in that regard, we have half of the country that is very well populated by total almost 55 million people these days, but the other half, very limited population, around only 10% of those 55 are really there, but with immense resources, but with a big territorial control of criminals for a long time. That's what we were able to change in the period between, I would say, the year 2000 and I would say 2015-16. We were very successful up to 15 doing all these things. We got this strong agreement with the United States named Plan Colombia. Plan Colombia is very interesting because it was very bipartisan. We were able to work with Democratic and Republican, both administrations and Congresses, and we were really able to work steadily with all the interagencies of the United States, the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the Department of Justice, and even specific agencies like the intelligence community agencies and other law enforcement, and even USA. USA play a big role into Colombian development policies and ways to move forward. We were so successful that I can even call the heroism of my soldiers and policemen to claim a victory in a counterinsurgency war. Let's remind that in counterinsurgency war victory is kind of defined at a time in which the opponent, the enemy, cannot achieve any political objective. And it's not the theory of kill them all, precisely because he's in counterinsurgency. So it means you have to release one side, our side, the side of the good guys, with the limitations and constraints of human rights, the law, and the international humanitarian law. That's how we fought, and that's how we won, which is the nicest of all this. No military dictatorship, purely through democracy and through this decision-making on cooperation. But since then, by the year 16, when the agreements of Havana did happen, sadly, the country started to take a different way. On one side, we got a political polarization and divide. So what I will describe as the establishment that confronted all these threats was divided now. Some of them wanted the peace agreements, some of them opposed those agreements. Opposition won that into the vote, and sadly the government that was in power decided to anyway push for the agreement. Those agreements brought, in my opinion, three negative things. Number one, the idea of impunity for the most dramatic crimes against humanity. These gentlemen that were in that, if I can call them like that, were the leaders of the FARC and then became the senators of Colombia with no cost. And at the same time with the tribunals that are mainly going after the military, and honestly with the FARC more offering a cleanup of their previous crimes. The second thing that came out of that was the expansion of cocaine business again. We were able to tap it down with a very big effort between US and Colombia, and since then, it has only skyrocketed to the level that this year, 2025, is the largest ever production of cocaine in the history of Colombia. And it's not anymore being sent to the US, that still consumes more than any other country, but the Europeans, but the Asians, and the bad news now, the Latin Americans are becoming consumers. So all this production has a market, and it's a market that has continued to fund all these crimes. And thirdly, the military and the security capabilities that we created, and probably you, Eliot, came to Colombia and you saw with some kind of, I should be humble on this, but I feel very proud of my military at that time. We were able to really become one of the most professional and high-level standards combat forces in the planet for the mission that we had. And I'm very proud of that because it happened out of this friendship with the US So we took advantage of that, long-term friendship. But at the same time, I'm very honored to see my people, how they fought, how they were committed, how professional they became, and how much they did to the country. But the bad news, since then, the old theory of peace dividend. Let's cut funds, let's reduce size, let's not keep containing all that we had in territory. And the consequence was the opening for a reinvigoration of criminal structures, now having the cocaine, now having the aspiration for impunity to re-engage and expand to territories. Where are we today? I think that after the COVID crisis, the COVID events, countries like Colombia, in essence, the whole world was very hit. But Colombia was hit hard, both fiscally, then of course, in the consequences of human lives. But the unemployment that was created was very large, and the poverty that was created in the way it was handled was critical. We jumped from 27% of Colombians in poverty to 37% of Colombians in poverty in less than a year. So that created a big stress, a big frustration, a big sense of weakness to the country. And that combined with organized crime structures, hoping for a revolution using a model of the old left by creating demonstrations, by creating violence, end up with a government of President Petro. Petro being a guy that used to be a guerrilla member of M19. M19 is famous for the spectacular criminal actions that they made. They were truly very bad terrorists, very like September, the Black September group that I remember from Israel, just to compare one case, meaning that instead of being effective military, they were effective in terms of political opinion and media. And they did spectacular things like burning the Justice Palace, or you can call the Supreme Court offices, as part of what they did in agreement with Pablo Escobar at that time. So they were really bad. They made the peace agreements in the 90s, early 90s, and then they got all the benefits. So this guy, Petro, was a member of the House, member of the Senate, a mayor, a diplomat from Colombia. So when he arrived to power, some of the people thought that he was going to represent the social agenda that was missing for a country like Colombia. And actually, probably that's how he got in. But first of all, his performance as manager and leader is very poor. He will not pass any exam at any school of management on no way. So the country has been deteriorating. What do we have today? A return on violence. So homicides are growing again. Territorial control by criminals is expanding. Cocaine is the largest business. Illegal gold mining is very large. The weakening of the military has been part of his agenda. It's not now an accident. It's the agenda to weaken them. And then you have other crises. We have a fiscal crisis. We have an energy crisis. We have a healthcare crisis, a pension system crisis, just to mention some of the challenges that we have right now. But the worst of all, and what worries me the most, that probably will open up to speak on other things. He has understood his time as the opportunity of being not the politician that was seasoned through different political positions, but to go back and be this 25-old guerrilla. He's seeing the global power competition as an opportunity. He's uniting with other leaders of Latin America to try to confront the United States and the Western democracies. And they are trying to go back to this old dream that they had prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, that allows them to think that we have the opportunity for socialismo. So socialism, as they call it, or neo-communism, as I like to refer to it, which is very weird because it's a combination of criminal activities with extreme political views with taking advantage of the global power competition. That three things producing a cocktail is a Molotov that we have right now. And more recently, he has been showing a special connection and respect to the leader of Venezuela, Maduro, who honestly, let's face it, he's a criminal, he's a thug, but at the same time, he has whole power illegally. He lost in an election. He made fraud in front of the whole world. And he's now supported by Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and in Latin America by Cuba, by Nicaragua, and now that by Bolivia, which happily might have a change in path considering elections the day before. Yesterday they had elections, and apparently there will be democratic people that will hold power. And that's the way I see it. It's not right against the left. It's democracies and values of freedom in the West opposing autocracies, and the combination for autocracies with crime, organized crime, and very bad intentions for societies. That's where we are right now, but we need to change that, some 10 months from now, and that's part of our intent.
I wonder if I could ask you, on one of my very last days in government, I went to the White House for a presidential ceremony of awarding the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And President Bush 43 awarded it to three world leaders to whom he felt particularly close. One was Tony Blair. The other was President Aznar of Spain. And the third was President Uribe of Colombia. He is now on trial, and I confess I've completely lost the plot. So what, can you give us the context for this? Is this a serious issue of corruption, or is this the politicization of the justice system?
I will go straight forward. I see it as a politicization of the justice system. Uribe was put into a process in which the leader of the extreme left opposition that honestly had ties with the FARC at a time. Even his father was, playing this double role that was very typical in the liberation movements, in which they played politics at day and guerrilla at night. So that was a little bit of his father. So he put Uribe into a plot. These gentlemen went to jails looking for former paramilitary in jail to ask for them to accuse Uribe of paramilitary activities. Some of them came out and said, hey, we're getting the visit of this senator, so this is what he's trying. So Uribe went back after this guy. But then the court, by a little bit of politicization and somehow the preference of the narrative of the left against the right, they went after Uribe by saying, well, now he's trying to put some people against this pure senator. So they, shifted totally 360 degrees the kind of problem. But the reality is that when you saw what did happen in that trial, it was clearly a political intention of, identifying a judge with certain qualities and certain past, and everything that was presented, at least in an objective court, probably will have different impressions. I am very much institutional, and I'm very convinced on the need to respect the rule of law and the rulings of courts. That's what makes you a believer in democracy and freedom. But I cannot stand comfortably with what I saw they did to President Uribe, because at the end, to me, it is part of a plot, of the current plot, which means if we can put Uribe in jail, we can kill the candidate that somehow was representing some of the ideas of that sector. Then we can offer a national agreement by offering a peace agreement, that's what Petro is intending, with multiple criminal groups, former guerrillas, new bands, new cartels, etc., and offering a national agreement in which someone like Uribe can be seen as, okay, we can offer you freedom, but we're going to give freedom to everybody. But in exchange, they want to reform the constitution in a way that that constitution would make Colombia look like, let's say, a socialist country in Latin America, following the ideas of a movement that was created by a forum in Sao Paulo that happened like 2 decades ago, in which those who lost the losers of the Cold War united for the purpose of creating a new narrative for Latin America and to regain power slowly but steadily, but then, making all these countries going backwards in some sense of socialism that they call Socialismo Siglo XXI, which was at the end Chavez movement in Venezuela. I'm probably saying a lot of stuff, but I'm trying to give you all the context so our viewers can get to see, all the angles where all these things are happening.
So, Juan Carlos, I very vividly remember several visits to Colombia, including going out into the field with you, and it was really quite marvelous watching you deal with soldiers in the field. And I was very struck by their professionalism. At one point, I remember visiting a camp where American Special Forces soldiers, in theory, were trained in Colombia. I went up to them and I said, "So, what's your take on the Colombian soldiers?" They said, "Actually, they don't really need us. They're as good as we are." Which I thought was quite a testament to them. But so here's my question. There is something heartbreaking about all this. By the way, if our listeners are interested, you should try to get a hold of a copy of Uribe's memoir, which I thought was quite a remarkable account of the how he thought about turning Colombia around. But you guys really had one, and you could tell when you visited that the country was much more secure. Places like Medellin were, and other cities were safe, or certainly much safer. FARC had been on the run. You were scooping them up in these quite daring raids into the jungle. How did it fall apart? That's what honestly what I don't understand. I mean, do you have an explanation for it? Because it seemed to me that you had them where you wanted them, and the country was doing extremely well, and then somehow it seems to have fallen away. Was it just an accident?
So, as you can imagine, Eliot, I spent day and night for years struggling with this and thinking, what happened? What was missing? What was wrong? And what I can tell you is a little bit of the reinterpretation of Clausewitz's concept. That old famous line that everybody uses, which is, war is politics by other means. That's true for our democracies and it's true for institutions. So it's kind of, for us, war is the exchange of fire, the friction of forces, the military component of conflict. And that's a big mistake from our side. Because we end war the day the guns, stop firing. For autocrats and for those regimes that use these theories of hybrid war or the theory of the use of all forms of fighting as part of their doctrine, really the real concept for them is that politics is war by other means. And to me, that's exactly what happened. We did our job. I mean, the military, the police, the state, by defeating them to the point that they didn't have any other choice, that stopped fighting and finding a political solution. But that's where everything changes. Inside the system of the political solution, few things happen. First, on the Colombian establishment, a total divide. Those who accepted the agreements and those who disagree with the agreements. So that, broke Colombia in parts. Second, from the guerrilla side and their ideologues and the people that was playing the role of the Foro de Sao Paulo and this idea of the new socialism, the peace agreement was the opportunity to get into the system, take power on their own hands, infiltrate the system in a way and expand the fight between the establishment to a point that allowed them to gain power through democratic means. And I said quote unquote because one of the big mistakes of the agreements were allowing the FARC or the country to expand the business of cocaine again. because that's the gasoline, if I can describe it like that, of all wars and corruption. So that's exactly what is being going on. These groups have been taking power, using criminal activities as part of their political activities. Now they have created a new approach, which is justify crime and blame others. So why there exists crime in Colombia, according to them? Well, because there are elites. Why does cocaine is produced? Because it's the fault of the Americans. Why we have these problems? Well, because the world is destroying with hydrocarbons the environment, and instead of that, we have even cocaine as an option. It's incredible what I'm saying. It's so absurd, but it's a narrative that starts to stick and becomes, as I said, politics is war for other means. Their aim is power. Our aim was democracy. Totally different concepts. And that's the thing that I believe can be used as the experience for Colombia, but to try to understand this throughout the world. When I see what is going on in Ukraine, when I see what is going on in the Middle East, Israel, and all these regions, I see that very clear now. I see that they play with other tools other than the use of kinetic force. We tend to think that kinetic force is the end, and that's how we end conflicts. Forget about it. That's not how modern warfare is happening, especially with in my opinion, the Russian doctrine that is somehow reinvigorating all these ideas. And somehow the Chinese, in a way, they use multiple tools for the purpose of expanding power. I like to think that when the US thought about creating a National Security Council, meaning that was not only DOD, but then you had to have all other elements of power, that's the way to think conflict and war. It's not just the use of the military. And probably it's a long answer, but I think it's a reflection on years of trying to understand how these came and, what happened. Now, I can blame by name people, but that's not about what is important here. What is important here is to understand how we can confront this to the future, learn from what we had, and try to reduce mistakes to the future, meaning that still we were going to commit some mistakes even ahead.
Before we came on in the green room, Ambassador Pinzón, you were talking a little bit about the last 8 months of U.S. hemispheric relations and how much has been going on and the role of Secretary Rubio. I wonder if you'd share a little bit of that with us as well, how you see these things playing out. Because as you pointed out, although I think for most of our viewers, they would find, that it would be hard to find in American newspapers much coverage of any of this, that a lot's been going on.
Well, let me start with this. What I've been doing these past 3 years is teaching on political economy in Latin America. And as much as I study that and the whole national security and geopolitical discussions on that, I get frustrated both sides, from Latin American view and the US perspective. We have missed the big opportunity of making the Western Hemisphere the most powerful and the most independent from the whole world. And everybody has to be blamed onto this. In a way, the US likes to look very much to the sides. So you love to look to your side in the Atlantic. That's where your heritage come from. So it's kind of, you love it. And then you love to look to the Pacific because that's what you conquer. And somehow, that's where the greatness of America came and where the big stuff in economics and power is happening. But for years, South has been only being referred to, in my opinion, for problems. Always immigration. Yeah, but because of immigration, you have a lot of low-cost jobs. And that allows America to have multiple opportunities that gives productivity, a take. And then you have in the South a big market. We Latin Americans are 700 million people. So it's a lot of people. Just to remind, if we put together the hemisphere, we're 1.1 million people. So it's kind of, just comparable to China, India, and nobody else in size of people. But then we have more natural resources than them: water, minerals, food production, biodiversity. Everything we want, we have in this hemisphere. But sadly, that's a good story to tell, very far from reality, to think about that. But I push this idea because I've been trying to do that in my classes at Princeton, and every time I can, I try to, bring this herald and invite people to think like that, because we probably, the current history, historic times, is pushing us to maybe think differently. And maybe this is the time to do it. By saying that, I think there's a lot of people and multiple governments that have tried to do things for Latin America. I'm not saying not. Even from President Roosevelt, he did things during wartime. I think President Truman started to find engagement. Eisenhower did a lot. Kennedy was beloved. He was revered in Latin America more even than in the U.S. Then we have President Reagan, who tried to engage a lot. You have someone like President Clinton and President Bush, who tried to create the whole America's market. And those were intents that were being done a long time. Obama is his part. I think President Trump tried some things, and definitely President Biden had a big heart for Latin America. Probably he didn't have a big bandwidth really to work onto that. But in the past 8 months, a lot of things have happened. I cannot say if they're going to be good or bad. One thing that I've learned being twice ambassador to the U.S. and engaging with the U.S. is don't mess with American politics, and I will not mess with American politics by no mean, no way. That's my red line on any conversation. But, I don't know how this is going to work. But the reality is that we have a Secretary of State, a real expert on foreign relations and intelligence. Secretary Rubio was a very relevant senator in those committees. But he's an expert in Latin America, probably the highest ever in the job, meaning that he knows the region, that he has ties with the region, that he understands us because he's one of us in terms of background, and he speaks the language, so he knows the region. And few things have happened, in the region actively. One, it started with Panama. There's a big debate again with the Panama Canal. Is that a bad idea or a good idea? Well, it is part of the discussion. It happened with a big relationship with El Salvador, a very tiny country that always has taken a lot of effort and energy from America, and still again is taking your energy by having all these jails in which the U.S. is trying to send some of the criminals that happen to be related to migration to El Salvador. Then you have the problems with Mexico. Mexico is a real challenge, and they have a president that plays the game very well. So she looks very smart and sophisticated, but her heart is very close to the other team, not to America. And at the same time, Mexico is becoming very federalized, meaning that cartels run multiple regions of the country. Each cartel runs its own region. So it's a very problematic country in terms of not only migration, but narcotics for the U.S., and that's a debate. Then you have the case of Brazil, in which Brazil is one of the leaders of BRICS. BRICS are trying to create a new economic paradigm in the world, including a new currency. And of course, they've been targeted by the Trump administration by currently having 50% tariffs, which is a real consequential discussion. Not to forget that the challenge with Colombia has been in the open. The president of Colombia has become confrontational, and that has created a lot of irritation in the relationship that we hadn't seen before. Actually, last week, we had here in Colombia, in Bogota, 2 senators from the U.S., one from Ohio and one from Arizona, with a Colombian background. Their parents were born in Colombia. It's very unique. And their voters, actually, their constituents are not Colombians. They're very much from Ohio and very much from Arizona, but they care for the relationship and the country. So it was interesting to see how they try to, somehow ameliorate the confrontation with Petro here. And then more recently, the U.S. established a reward for $50 million for the leader of Venezuela, or Maduro, which is considered by the U.S. and myself, I do have the same perception, as an illegal president. He made a fraud. His political organization has been considered a cartel de los soles, and the U.S. declared that cartel as a terrorist organization. And because of that, there are rumors, at least in the open source media, that there's a naval exercise, including a carrier group in the Caribbean, intending probably to send a clear signal, if not eventually a use of force against Maduro. So all this has happened in 8 months. And that's the part I want just to look at. Everything that I just said are events of the past 8 months. So the engagement is bigger, probably is frictional in some cases. Probably they're trying to confront what I think has happened in the region, and this is a line I believe is important. So there are 3 countries that have been very much against democracy. That's Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And they have joined forces for the competitors of the US, meaning Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Then there are other groups that are of countries that have connections with them, like Bolivia. Then you have other group of countries that are opposing the policy of the United States. They are trying to blame Trump, but they were trying already to have a consultation before, even during Biden time. That's Brazil from Lula, BRICS. That's Mexico from López Obrador and now from Sheinbaum, which have an ideological odd against the US. And that's Petro from Colombia. It's very hard for me to say that it's Colombia in this list, just because we happen to be the closest ally of the United States in the Western Hemisphere and the major non-NATO ally that you had in the neighborhood. So it's very clear the intentions of Petro of being put into that. And these 3 countries, Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, are the most populous countries in the region, the largest in a way. And of course, their influence in smaller countries in Central America and South America is substantial. So that's something that I guess the US has perceived. And because of that, we see this kind of list of activities that I described some minutes ago.
You know, one country you didn't mention, which I find fascinating, is Argentina, where you have a president who is in many ways remarkably pro-American, and certainly on good terms with the Trump administration, as far as I can tell, and who's taking a very different course. You could call President Milei many things. Socialist is not one of the words that one would use to describe him, I think. You know, how does he fit into this picture? Is he regarded by other Latin Americans as crazy, as in the pocket of the Americans? I mean, one of the things that is striking is, to the extent I understand the Argentine economic statistics, he's actually doing pretty well.
Right. Well, he comes from this new, I would say, populist agenda that is happening worldwide in democracies. He arrived through being a very good performer, but it happens to be that he's a performer, but he's a great economist. And he came as an economist to run the country. So he has been able to reduce inflation, to cut the fiscal deficit, and has created conditions for investment. And honestly, Argentina is that effort is starting to pay off. The big question always about Argentina is how sustainable those policies are, because they have had a lot of good people in the past, and at the end they don't sustain in a way. The question is, can Milei effort be sustainable? Well, it would be good for Argentina if it happens, and I wish it happens. At the same time, of course, his line of thought, his policies are becoming more popular in certain countries, including countries like Paraguay, like El Salvador, like Ecuador, and even people in the opposition in countries like Chile and Colombia are starting to see his model or his cause as a political statement. I think that has been important, and he's part of the struggle. Of course, he's perceived by Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and the other countries that I mentioned as a bad guy, as their opponent, and I think he's playing very well that role in a way that at least has created an alternative option that appears to be more successful, at least in economics, short term. Let's see how it goes ahead.
Yeah. Can I ask one other question, then throw it back to Eric? Obviously, I don't want to ask you to comment on American politics. I think that's any ambassador would be wise to take your advice. But you're, as I said, you're a friend of the United States. You've lived here many years. You've been ambassador twice, and so you observe us. And I guess the question that I would like to ask you is this: there's some people who think the United States is in crisis. I mean, there's obviously a lot of political turmoil. That it's in crisis, or even that in some ways it's decline. That the American century is over. American influence is really it has diminished a great deal and will continue to diminish into the future because of the rise of China and other things. Other people say no, that there's an enormous amount of dynamism in this country, and that we're going through a populist moment. It's not the first. It probably won't be the last. And even that will eventually work itself out into some sort of new synthesis. And there are, I'm sure, plenty of other positions one could take. What would be your assessment of the country overall, not of any particular political leader or party?
Well, I have to be honest. First, I want America to succeed, and I want America to succeed because beyond my appreciation for the country, I think it's good for the world. If we have a freedom and the essence of the values that America has represented, I think continues to be the best option for societies. And, that's what we want to see. At the same time, I'm worried about the lack of consensus that you have in America. And that to me is the major challenge that democracies, but certainly exemplifying America, we're having. We have lost the track to build consensus. We are not having national plans anymore. We have political groups, not even parties, political groups, ideas for power rather than a vision for a country. And I think that will be great. If America can recover that potential of building up consensus and through consensus create longer view and more steady process. But at the same time, America continues to have some elements of power that are impossible to replace even in decades if others even try. One to me is the innovation capacity and the model of entrepreneurship that allows to spur almost unlimited creativity and knowledge. And of course, that needs to continue to be cherished and taken care of, but it's a big asset that the U.S. continues to have. Second, I think that America, the world is becoming difficult everywhere. And, for any investor in the world, you have to ask yourself, if I have to put some money in a safe haven, where do I put it? And you can say, yeah, America has a big deficit. They are struggling inside. There's a big concern. But where else will you put that money? So maybe it's not anymore that America is doing great on this front of being a safe haven, but there's no other safe haven yet. So it's like there's no option. So people continues to go there. And that happens from people in the Middle East, from people in Latin America, even the Chinese. What a wealthy Chinese will do? Take its money out as much as he can, right? And that's what we continue to see. America continues to be that safe haven for finance, for assets, for, hoping that in case of emergency, that's the place you want to be. Thirdly, continues to have this incredible military power that I wish can be handled the best possible way, is the only thing I would say. And, I would love to see some of the innovations and some of the things that I believe America can do continue to be work in the level of professionalism and proficiency that I've seen in the past. Certainly, I've seen myself in the past 20, 30 years. That will be great because, I will continue to expand those capabilities. So, as I said, I can go over and over and mention multiple other elements of power, but I think America, if can handle consensus at some point in certain key elements, yeah, others will expand. And I'm going to tell you my own story. If I can run my country, I want my country to be one of the powers in the adults table. That's what we want. That's the purpose of life. But what matters is the cooperation and the friendship and the big alliances that can be crafted. So, when I saw today's image of the European leaders and the President of the United States, for many people is what's going on. Maybe that meeting is not important or so. Depends on, the expertise and the knowledge. But to me, it's hopeful. That continues to prove that, leaders can gather and, that meeting is more important than any other in the world right now. So, yeah, that continues to be important. What I hope is that they can end in results in all these multiple problems that the world is confronting. Because on the other side, and when we think on the regular world order of the UN, it became very ineffective. And honestly, we need more effective way of doing things and executing decisions. So let's hope this new wave can bring a little bit of that at least.
We've run out of time, but I think that's a perfect note for us to end this conversation with. And Ambassador Pinzón, I'd just like to thank you for having to take the time and share all of your thoughts with us. And the one thing I'm going to take away is America is the least bad option. So that's a good thing.
To me, it's the best option, but for many, it's the least bad. For me, it's the best.
And I'll just add my thanks as well. And for Colombia's sake, I hope that the people there decide that you have more to give by way of leadership. And I know it'd be good for the United States as well. So we wish you all the luck in the world, and be careful.
Thank you, Eliot and Eric. What a great opportunity. And as I said, I'm very honored just to be able to chat and have a talk with you guys. Thank you.